Have you ever wondered how a forgotten civilization, one without mighty empires or endless armies, quietly shaped the very foundations of the modern world? Or how a handful of seafaring merchants managed to spread their language, their gods, and even their alphabet across continents, without ever conquering a single one? This is the story of Phoenicia, the elusive kingdom of purple dye, sea kings, and the birth of writing as we know it. A people who thrived not by war, but by trade. Who didn't build empires? They connected them, from the golden harbors of Tyre to the windswept coasts of Carthage. They ruled the waves long before the Greeks dreamed of democracy, or the Romans dreamed of conquest. But how did this small strip of coast, barely the size of modern-day Lebanon, become the crossroads of the ancient world? What secret did they possess that made empires bow, kings envy, and history remember them only in whispers? Let's set sail into the ancient Mediterranean, where purple seas shimmered with mystery, and one civilization quietly rewrote humanity's destiny. The shores of fire and trade. What if the greatest revolution in human history didn't begin with kings or armies, but with sails catching the wind? What if the alphabet that shaped our very words was born from the restless heartbeat of the sea? The story of Phoenicia begins where mountains kissed the Mediterranean on a narrow strip of land between fire and foam. It was a world of blazing sunsets over turquoise waters, cedar forests that perfumed the air, and cities that clung to the coast like glittering jewels. Tyre, Sidon, Byblos, Arwad, names that once echoed like a song through the ancient world. No empire claimed these lands completely. The Egyptians ruled to the south, the Hittites to the north, and later, the Assyrians came roaring like a storm. Yet between them, the Phoenicians survived. They had no empire, no vast armies, but they possessed something infinitely more dangerous to their rivals' knowledge. They understood the sea when others feared it. They understood commerce when others sought conquest. And they knew how to turn the smallest secrets of nature into the world's most valuable treasures. Their legend began with a color that kings would kill for from the rocky shores near Tyre. Fishermen discovered small shells of the murex snail. At first, they seemed ordinary until someone noticed that when the snails were crushed and left in the sun, they bled a vivid, deep purple that never faded. Under sunlight, it shimmered between crimson and violet, a hue unlike any other on earth. It became the dye of emperors, of priests, of gods themselves. To wear Phoenician purple was to declare power, divinity, and untouchable prestige. The process was grueling. Thousands of snails had to die for a single garment. The stench of rotting shells filled the harbors, and vats of dye bubbled like something alive. Yet out of that odor rose fortune and fame. Ships loaded with purple cloth left Phoenician ports and returned with gold, silver, ivory, and spices. Tyre and Sidon grew rich, so rich that poets later said their streets gleamed like bronze under the sun. But with wealth came danger. The Egyptians grew suspicious. The Hittites demanded tribute. Pirates hunted the Phoenician ships across the waves. Yet the sea was the Phoenicians' ally, not their enemy. They became the greatest sailors of their age, inventing ships that could cut through the water like knives. They built double-rowed galleys and massive cargo vessels called galoi, with curved hulls and billowing square sails. They followed the stars, using constellations to guide their journeys long before the Greeks learned to read the heavens. They sailed beyond the horizon, beyond fear, beyond the known world. As the centuries passed, their trade routes spread like veins through the Mediterranean. They reached Cyprus for copper, Crete for pottery, Egypt for papyrus, Greece for wine, and Spain for silver. They established colonies wherever the wind carried them, small outposts that later grew into cities: Utica, Gades, and Carthage. Each new shore became a spark in the growing constellation of Phoenician power, but for all their success, they faced one crippling problem: communication. Their merchants dealt with countless tongues: Egyptian hieroglyphs, Babylonian cuneiform, Greek symbols. Writing was sacred, slow, and restricted to priests and scribes. Imagine a merchant trying to keep track of debts, trade goods, and routes across dozens of lands using scripts that took years to master. It was impossible. So, in the middle of this chaos, the Phoenicians did something revolutionary. They took what the Egyptians and Mesopotamians had created and stripped it bare. No more complex symbols. No gods or animals for meaning. Instead, they made writing human. Each mark stood for a single sound that anyone could learn. 22 characters written from right to left. That's all it took to break the monopoly of scribes and priests. It was the first true alphabet. With it, they recorded contracts, carved ship manifests, and etched prayers to their gods. They passed it to sailors, to traders, to foreigners, and soon those foreigners began to adapt it. The Greeks added vowels. The Romans borrowed it from them. The alphabet you're reading now, your very language carries the ghost of Phoenician ink, but as their words spread, their power began to fracture. The cities of Phoenicia, Tyre, Sidon, Byblos were united only by the sea. Each was independent, ruled by its own king, often competing rather than cooperating. When foreign empires came, demanding loyalty or tribute, the Phoenicians often bent, not out of fear but out of calculation. They were survivors. When the Egyptians rose, they traded. When the Assyrians marched, they negotiated. They paid tribute, sent gifts, and continued to sail, yet compromise has a price. As Assyrian kings demanded heavier tribute. As Babylon's shadow stretched over the horizon, Phoenicia's freedom began to crack. Tyre, proud and defiant, refused to yield completely. Its people built their city not on land, but on an island, a fortress surrounded by water. It became the beating heart of resistance, a place where kings plotted and merchants whispered of rebellion. One legend tells of a Tyrian king who defied Babylon's might, who trusted in the sea more than any army. When Nebuchadnezzar's forces came, Tyre held out for 13 years behind its walls. 13 years, and still it did not fall. The sea kept it alive, but even victories born of the sea could not protect them forever. When new powers rose, Persia, then Greece, then Rome, the tide began to shift. The Phoenicians, the masters of trade and navigation, would soon find themselves swept into the currents of empires far larger than their imagination, and yet their influence would not vanish. For while others built monuments that time would crumble, the Phoenicians left behind something immortal: ideas. Their ships carried not only goods but gods, myths, and alphabets. The goddess Astarte became Ishtar in Babylon, then Aphrodite in Greece. Their cedar ships brought not just wood, but stories that blended into Greek legend and Roman memory. Even their greatest city abroad, Carthage, would rise to eclipse its motherland and empire of sailors. Descended from Tyre's blood, the Phoenicians had once ruled the waves. Soon, their descendants would challenge Rome itself, but that's a story still shrouded in the mists of destiny. For now, picture this: the last light of the sun spilling over the harbor of Tyre, sails glowing gold, the smell of purple dye heavy in the air. A merchant stares toward the horizon, his ledger filled with symbols that will one day form the languages of the world. He doesn't know it yet, but the alphabet he scratches onto papyrus will outlive every empire, every king, every war, and as the wind carries his ship into the dark, a question remains: what price will Phoenicia pay for the world it created? The empire of the sea kings. What if the greatest empire in history had no land, no borders, no army, and yet it ruled from one horizon to another? What if the Phoenicians, those quiet traders of the East, built an invisible kingdom upon the waves that lasted longer than the empires of Egypt, Greece, or even Rome? By the dawn of the first millennium BCE, Phoenicia's coastal cities gleamed like a chain of stars across the Mediterranean. From Tyre to Sidon, from Byblos to Arwad, their harbors were alive with shouts in a dozen tongues: Egyptian, Greek, Assyrian, Cretan, and languages long since lost to time. The smell of salt and cedar filled the air, mingling with the smoke of forges where bronze gleamed like sunrise. The sea was not a barrier for them. It was their road, their kingdom, their identity. They were not warriors. Their cities had no legions. Their kings wore no iron crowns. Yet their ships carried more power than any sword. Wherever the tide reached, so too did the will of Phoenicia. They did not conquer through blood. They conquered through exchange, Imagine a Tyrian galley gliding into an unfamiliar harbor in the Aegean. Local fishermen drop their nets, staring in awe. On board, Phoenician traders offer scarlet fabric, glass that glitters like frozen flame, carved ivory idols, and jars of fragrant oil. In return, they take tin from Britain, silver from Spain, and amber from the northern forests. The world becomes their market, and every port is a page in their story, yet for all their success, a shadow loomed over them, a growing sense that their power depended entirely on the mercy of the sea. Storms could erase fortunes in a night. A single wreck might send hundreds of souls to the deep. The Phoenicians respected the ocean as both god and grave. They worshipped Yam, the sea deity, whose moods decided their fate. Each voyage began with prayer and offering because for them, the waves were alive, the gods traveled with them. Baal, the stormbringer, and Astarte, goddess of love and war, sailed in the hearts of their sailors. At every port, small shrines rose to these deities. Over centuries, their faith would blend with others, Baal becoming Zeus to the Greeks, Astarte transforming into Aphrodite, her origins whispered through centuries of myth. And so, quietly, the Phoenicians changed the world's imagination as much as its trade, but as their power grew, so did their ambition. The crowded cities of Tyre and Sidon could no longer hold their restless children. They needed new lands, not for conquest, but for opportunity. And so began one of the greatest migrations in history. They sailed west, beyond Cyprus, beyond Greece, past the familiar blue waters into the unknown. There, they built colonies like sparks cast from a forge, Kishan on Cyprus, Utica on the African coast, Gade's modern Cadiz on the tip of Spain. But one colony would eclipse them all. A jewel that would one day turn into an empire of its own. Carthage, legend says it began with a woman. Her name was Alyssa, though the Romans would later call her Dido. She was a princess of Tyre, forced to flee her homeland after her brother murdered her husband for power. Heartbroken but defiant, she gathered a group of loyal followers, loaded ships with wealth, and sailed west into exile. After weeks at sea, she landed on the North African coast. There, she met the local chieftain, who agreed to give her as much land as she could cover with a bull's hide. Smiling, Dido sliced the hide into thin strips and laid them end to end around a vast hill. That place would become Carthage, the new city. From this cleverness, a legend was born. And Carthage, like Tyre before it, would grow rich beyond imagination, but the Phoenicians didn't just build cities, they built networks. From the silver mines of Iberia to the oases of North Africa, from Malta to Sicily, every port connected to another like threads of a grand tapestry. Their ships carried not just goods, but maps, languages, technologies, and ideas. Their sailors were the first to dare the Atlantic, reaching the mysterious coasts of Britain for tin and venturing possibly as far as the Canary Islands. In their time, the world seemed boundless, and they were the first to truly understand it. However, even as their influence spread, the Phoenicians remained fractured at home. Tyre, Sidon, and Byblos competed for dominance, jealous of each other's wealth. And in that division, empires found opportunity. The Assyrians struck first, demanding tribute. The Phoenicians paid, but at a cost their pride. Tyre resisted. The Assyrians attacked. But Tyre was an island, and their ships supplied it with food and hope. The siege lasted years, and though the Assyrians ravaged the mainland, they could not break the city's will. Tyre endured, yet the reprieve was temporary. When Babylon rose from the ashes of Nineveh, its king, Nebuchadnezzar II, turned his wrath on Tyre. 13 brutal years, he laid siege to its walls. The mainland fell, but the island city stood defiant, fed by the sea. When the siege finally ended, Tyre still stood, but its spirit was scarred. Many of its people had fled to the colonies, to Carthage, to the farthest edges of the known world. The Phoenicians had survived yet another storm, but something had changed. No longer were they just traders. Their colonies had matured, grown powerful, and begun to think of themselves not as outposts of Tyre, but as nations in their own right. Carthage especially had begun to dream dangerous dreams. The student would soon surpass the master. As the centuries turned, the Mediterranean was no longer the same. Greek city-states rose to glory. Persia's empire spread like fire. Egypt declined. But wherever you looked, Athens, Babylon, Rome, there was always a whisper of Phoenicia. Their ships, their letters, their gods, their ideas woven invisibly into every culture that followed. The Phoenicians had given humanity trade, navigation, and language. But in giving the world so much, they had made themselves obsolete. The great cities of their homeland would one day fall silent, their names remembered only in scrolls, yet before that silence came one final echo, one last civilization born from their blood that would shake the world itself, for beyond the pillars of Hercules, across the wine-dark sea, Carthage was rising, and its queen would teach Rome to fear the sea. Carthage, daughter of the sea and fire, what happens when a child outgrows its parent? When the student, born of trade and survival, learns to wield empire and power? From the ashes of Tyre, across the horizon where the sun set into gold, a new city rose, one that would carry the Phoenician dream farther than any before. Its name was Carthage, and soon the world would tremble at its sails. The year was around 814 BCE on the North African coast. The waves curled against a crescent bay. A fleet of ships from Tyre had just landed, weary from exile, their sails ragged, their hearts unbroken. At their head was Queen Alyssa Dido, as she would later be remembered by poets. She had fled betrayal, sailed through storms, and now stood before a new world. The air smelled of wild thyme and salt. Behind her stretched desert. Before her, infinity, she made a vow to her people. They would build a city so strong, so radiant, that no empire could erase them again, and so Carthage was born. The city rose from the red African earth, built in perfect harmony with sea and land. High walls encircled it. Docks stretched like arms into the blue. Its heart was the great circular harbor, the coffin, a marvel of engineering that no rival could match. Inner docks sheltered the war fleet. Outer ones housed merchant ships. At its center stood a command tower from which the admiral could see every vessel, every tide, every movement across the horizon. The Phoenicians had built cities before, but never one like this. Carthage was both fortress and marketplace, temple and machine. And it thrived. Soon, the trade routes of old Phoenicia flowed into its harbors. Silver from Spain, ivory from Africa, grain from Sicily, gold from the Sahara. The purple dye of Tyre still stained the hands of its merchants. Carthage didn't just inherit Phoenicia's wealth, it amplified it. The sea became its empire, but Carthage was not merely a daughter, it was a new breed. The Carthaginians were still Phoenicians at heart, traders, navigators, cunning negotiators, yet they had learned the lessons. Their ancestors never could. The world was not ruled by trade alone. It was ruled by power. So Carthage built fleets, vast fleets of bronze-tipped galleys, ships lined with rams that could split an enemy vessel in two. They hired mercenaries from across the known world, Numidians, Iberians, Gauls, and turned their harbor into an engine of conquest. Trade and war became two sides of the same coin. From its citadel on Byrsa Hill, Carthage ruled the western Mediterranean. Her influence stretched from Libya to Spain, from Sardinia to Corsica. Her silver mines in Iberia poured wealth into her coffers. Her harbors outshone all others. The world had never seen such a city, not born from empire, but from ingenuity. And yet, in every triumph, a shadow lingered. Carthage's success drew envy like blood draws sharks. To the east, the Greeks were expanding too. City-states like Syracuse and Massilia, modern Marseille, dotted the coasts, hungry for trade and territory. To the north, another power was rising, young but ambitious. Rome. At first, the two knew of each other only by reputation. Rome, a land power. Carthage, a sea power. But destiny had already placed them on a collision course. The first spark came in Sicily, a land that both claimed, both needed. For Carthage, Sicily was the granary of the Mediterranean. For Rome, it was the stepping stone to expansion. What began as skirmishes between allies spiraled into all-out war. The First Punic War, for 23 years, Carthage and Rome fought over a single island. The sea turned red with battle. The Romans, at first clumsy sailors, copied Carthaginian ships plank by plank. They invented the corvus, a boarding bridge that turned naval combat into land warfare. Carthage's fleets were unmatched in speed, but Rome's discipline was relentless. When the war finally ended, Carthage lost Sicily. It was the first time the Sea Kings had truly been defeated, but Carthage did not crumble. It adapted, just as Phoenicia once had. A generation later, under the brilliant general Hamilcar Barca, the Carthaginians turned west. They conquered Spain, mined its silver, trained new armies, and taught their sons the art of patience. One of those sons was Hannibal. From the moment he was a child, Hannibal was sworn to hate Rome. His father took him to the altar of Balhaman, made him place his hand upon a sacred flame, and vow eternal enmity. Hannibal's hatred was not born of rage, it was inherited, carved into his blood like destiny. Years passed. Carthage recovered its strength. The Romans grew complacent. And then, in 218 BCE, Hannibal Barca unleashed a plan so audacious, so impossible, that it defied the gods themselves. Instead of attacking by sea, he would march his army over the Alps, tens of thousands of soldiers, hundreds of war elephants, endless supplies, all driven into the frozen peaks between Spain and Italy. Men froze, elephants fell, entire units vanished into the snow. Yet Hannibal pressed on, eyes burning with the same fire that had once built Tyre and Sidon, when he finally descended into the plains of Italy. His army was battered but unbroken, and the Romans were unprepared. At Trebia, he crushed them. At Lake Trasimene, he destroyed them again. And then came Cannae, one of the most brilliant battles in history. On that blood-soaked field, Hannibal encircled an army twice his size and annihilated it. Rome lost 50,000 men in a single day. The world gasped. It seemed the Sea Kings had returned, not from Tyre, not from Sidon, but from Carthage. The descendants of the Phoenicians had brought their vengeance to the heart of Italy, yet, like their ancestors, Carthage carried within it the seeds of division. The city's rulers hesitated. They feared Hannibal's ambition, withheld reinforcements, argued over trade instead of destiny. Rome, disciplined and patient, recovered. The tides began to turn. In time, Carthage fell as Tyre once had. Its harbors burned, its walls torn down. Rome salted its earth so nothing would grow, but destruction could not erase the truth. Carthage's fire lived on, in its innovations, in its courage, in its defiance. The Phoenician blood had not vanished. It had simply changed shape, flowing like the sea that birthed it. Centuries later, as Latin scholars wrote their alphabets, as merchants sailed new oceans, as explorers traced the coasts of unknown continents, they followed maps and symbols that carried the fingerprints of the Phoenicians, for even in ruin, the Sea Kings still ruled in silence, in memory, and in every word humanity would ever write. But one question still remained unanswered. How did this people, who gave the world the alphabet, glass, and navigation, simply vanish from history's stage? The vanishing kingdom. How does a civilization disappear without dying? How can a people who taught the world to write, to sail, to trade, simply fade into the background of history, leaving behind only fragments of names and symbols? By the dawn of the 1st century BCE, the Mediterranean had changed beyond recognition. The sea that once belonged to Phoenician ships now bore Roman triremes and Greek merchant fleets. The harbors of Tyre and Sidon still stood, but their walls were scarred, their flags replaced by foreign emblems. The age of the Sea Kings was ending, not in fire, but in silence. The destruction of Carthage had been the final blow, yet the story didn't end with its ashes. Across the eastern coast, in Lebanon's mountains and valleys, small Phoenician communities still thrived. Craftsmen, shipwrights, traders. They had no empire, no armies, but they still carried within them the same restless heart that had once pushed their ancestors across the horizon. Yet history has a cruel way of erasing those who refuse to fight for it. The Greeks absorbed their myths, the Romans took their gods, and their alphabet, once their proudest creation, became the very tool of their own obscurity. When people wrote, they no longer thought of Tyre or Byblos. They thought of Athens, of Rome, of the new powers who ruled the narrative. Still, traces remained. In Tyre, Purple dye vats still simmered beside the sea, staining the rocks crimson. Merchants still carved inscriptions in a script that had already evolved into the letters we use today. The cedar forests of Lebanon still whispered the same scent that had once filled Pharaoh's temples. Even the old gods refused to vanish entirely. Astarte became Aphrodite. Baal became Zeus. Melkart, the protector of Tyre, lived on as Hercules in Greek myth. The Phoenicians had been woven into the myths of their conquerors not as ghosts, but as forgotten architects. The Romans, practical and proud, admired Phoenician skill, but feared their legacy. In Carthage's ruins, they built their own city, layer upon layer, until Phoenician stones became Roman foundations. But beneath those stones, history never stopped whispering. Roman merchants still used Phoenician routes. Their sailors still studied Phoenician maps. Their soldiers marched through towns whose names, Sidon, Tyre, Byblos, were echoes of an age before theirs, and in one of history's cruelest twists, the very language that conquered the Phoenicians, Latin, owed its alphabet to them. The Romans unknowingly spoke through Phoenician breath, but if the world forgot them, nature did not. In 332 BCE, long before Carthage's fall, Alexander the Great had marched into Phoenicia. Sidon surrendered peacefully, but Tyre resisted, confident in its island fortress. The sea, after all, had protected it for centuries. But Alexander was no ordinary conqueror. He ordered a causeway built, a half-mile bridge of stone and earth stretching from the mainland to the island. For 7 months, the Macedonians labored under constant attack, waves crashing, towers burning. Finally, they breached Tyre's walls. The city fell, and thousands were killed or sold into slavery. It was the death knell of Phoenician independence. Yet Alexander admired their courage and their craftsmanship. He spared the temples, restored trade, and made Tyre one of his naval bases. Even in defeat, the Phoenicians were indispensable. The paradox became their destiny. Every conqueror who subdued them ended up depending on them. The Persians had used their ships. The Greeks adopted their gods. The Romans built their fleets in their harbors. The Phoenicians were never truly gone, only invisible. Woven into the fabric of every empire that came after, their merchants adapted again. They spoke Greek in one century, Latin in the next. They traded Roman glass instead of Phoenician purple, built temples for new gods, and sent their sons to study in Roman schools. The world moved forward, and the people who had once ruled the waves blended quietly into it. Like dye sinking into cloth, unseen, yet coloring everything it touched, still, something remained unbroken. The alphabet from the coast of Lebanon. Its 22 characters spread across continents, evolving into Greek, Latin, and Arabic. It crossed oceans, adapted to new sounds, new tongues, and new empires. In time, it would become the script of the modern world. The Phoenicians had given humanity the greatest gift of all, the power to record memory itself, and in doing so, they became immortal without knowing it, but their disappearance left behind a mystery that still haunts historians. Who were they, truly? Were they one people or many cities bound by trade? Were they innovators or merely survivors? How could a civilization that connected the ancient world so completely leave behind so few words about itself? Perhaps that was their final genius. The Phoenicians didn't need monuments. They didn't carve their history into stone because they built it into humanity itself. Their cities may have fallen, but their alphabet never did. And yet, as centuries passed and Rome itself crumbled, even the memory of Phoenicia turned to myth. Medieval scholars thought of them only as merchants of Tyre, minor footnotes in biblical verses. Their gods were rebranded as demons. Their ports filled with new tongues, Arabic, Latin, Turkish. The people changed, the borders shifted, but the coastline remained, whispering with the same waves that once carried their ships to every shore. In time, archaeology would uncover the truth. Beneath Roman ruins, Phoenician walls. Beneath sand and ash, inscriptions written in a script both alien and familiar. Glass beads, purple stains, tiny clay anchors, remnants of a civilization that refused to die quietly, and then, one day, someone would find a stone tablet, marked with symbols older than Greece, older than Rome, the letters that began it all. The alphabet's birthplace had been found. It was as if the dead had begun to speak again, but the question that now rises from those ancient ruins is not where the Phoenicians went, but how they live on within us. Because every letter we write, every word we speak, carries a piece of them, the unseen architects of civilization. Still, there remains one final chapter in their tale, one last voyage across the world's memory, where myth, mystery, and discovery converge to reveal what the Phoenicians truly left behind. And that final journey begins now. The legacy beneath the waves. What if the sea that once carried their ships still guards their secrets? What if the story of the Phoenicians, the traders, the wanderers, the invisible empire has never truly ended, but merely sank beneath the tide, waiting for the world to listen again? It begins with a whisper of surf against stone. Somewhere along the coast of modern Lebanon, divers descend beneath turquoise waters and find walls massive, ancient, half-buried. Fragments of pottery still shimmer with purple stains. The skeleton of a ship, its cedar timbers preserved by salt and time, lies silent. It is as though the sea itself has remembered what history forgot. For centuries, the Phoenicians were ghost-talked about but never seen. Historians knew their name from Greek and Roman texts, but their own voices were gone. No epic poems, no chronicles, no royal decrees survived. Only the faint traces of trade coins, jars, scarabs, and inscriptions carved in an alphabet that looked strangely familiar. The puzzle of Phoenicia remained unsolved until the 20th century, when archaeologists began to uncover the bones of their lost world. In Byblos, the oldest of their cities, they unearthed temples older than the pyramid stone sanctuaries dedicated to Balat-Gabal, the Lady of Byblos. In Sidon, they found tombs filled with jewelry, ivory, and delicate glass beads that predated Roman glassmaking by centuries. In Tyre, beneath layers of conquest, they discovered the workshops where the legendary purple dye was made. Thousands of crushed murex shells piled into ancient heaps. The smell, even after thousands of years, was said to linger faintly in the earth, but the most astonishing discovery was not what the Phoenicians had left behind. It was where they had gone, across the Mediterranean. From North Africa to Spain, archaeologists began finding the same pottery, the same inscriptions, the same trade goods. In Cadiz, fragments of Phoenician amphorae. In Malta, a shrine to Astarte. In Sardinia, a harbor laid out like Tyre's own. Even far beyond the Strait of Gibraltar, near the coast of Morocco, and possibly as far as the Canary Islands, traces of their presence lingered. The Phoenicians had gone farther than anyone imagined, perhaps even farther than history dared to believe. Herodotus, the ancient Greek historian, once wrote that a Phoenician fleet, under orders from an Egyptian pharaoh, sailed around Africa 2,000 years before Vasco da Gama. Most dismissed it as a myth. But modern evidence, the winds, the currents, the ancient ship designs suggests it might have been possible. If true, it means the Phoenicians were the first to circumnavigate a continent, centuries before the word explorer even existed, and yet, despite their reach, they never sought to rule. They didn't plant flags or proclaim conquests. They built relationships, networks, and trust. They taught others how to sail, how to write, how to trade. Theirs was not an empire of swords, but of symbols, a web of human connections spun across the known world. Perhaps that is why they were forgotten. Empires write history in blood and monuments. The Phoenicians wrote it in ink and memory. And memory, unlike stone, fades when no one tends it. Still, their spirit found ways to survive. The glassblowers of Sidon taught techniques that shaped Roman art for centuries. The alphabet of Tyre gave birth to Greek, then Latin, then every Western language that followed. Even their myths traveled through time, reappearing under new names: Melkart reborn as Hercules, Astarte as Venus, Bohemond as Saturn. They had not vanished, they had transformed. The irony of their story lies in its quiet power. A people who left so few words behind ended up defining how words themselves are written. Their greatest monument is invisible, the alphabet that covers every book, every screen, every spoken promise. Each time you write a letter, you are tracing their legacy with your own hand, but their story holds a deeper truth, one that stretches beyond history. The Phoenicians remind us that civilization is not built by those who shout the loudest or conquer the most. It is built by those who connect, who trade, who teach, who listen. They were not warriors, but navigators of oceans, of cultures, of human understanding. Their map of the world was not drawn in borders, but in routes. Their empire had no capital, because it lived in motion. Even now, the sea they once ruled continues to reveal their presence. Off the coast of Spain, divers uncover amphorae still sealed with pitch. In Tunisia, the ruins of Carthage whisper through the dust. In modern Lebanon, the names of their cities, Tyre, Sidon, Byblos, still appear on road signs. Thousands of years have passed, yet their pulse still beats in the rhythm of waves. Perhaps that is their truest victory. They defied oblivion not by force, but by endurance. Their language lives in ours. Their roots became our world's arteries. Their inventions became our civilization's bones, and maybe, when you stand at the edge of the sea and listen closely to the wind, you can still hear the echo of their ships' creaking timbers, snapping sails, and the faint, haunting cry of sailors who once mapped the unknown. The world remembers its conquerors in stone, but it remembers its creators in silence. The Phoenicians were both. They conquered not the land, but time. And though their cities lie in ruins, their legacy sails on every letter, every word, every breath that carries a story across the human heart.